Hello, everyone. Welcome to Team Fantasy Life breaking down, yes, the Davante Adams trade that conveniently happened right after Dwain, McFarland, and myself just spent an hour doing our usual Fantasy Life show morning. But Dwain, an emergency trade calls for an emergency video, and here we are again. Davante Adams is being sent to the Jets for a third-round pick that can turn into a second based on his performance, and the Jets will also be eating reportedly the entirety of his contract. So certainly seems like this was a decision made after that disappointing Monday night loss, Dwayne.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is huge news. Like we don't get news this big that often during the NFL season. I mean, there are a lot of implications like we can jump into wherever you want to start. We start with the quarterback, we start with the receivers themselves. There's implications down to the running backs here. A lot of stuff going on that's definitely changing the landscape of the way we look at all the players on the Jets for the rest of the season.
First of all, just good news for the Jets. We can talk about long-term, whatever, but for the 2024 New York Jets, you just added a guy who's been one of the NFL's best wide receivers for the better part of the last half decade. And I know had the hamstring injury, Dwain, but certainly expecting that to be just fine now. And, even though we didn't see the best 2-year stretch from him recently, had 110 yards and a touchdown as recently as week 2 against the Ravens. I do think the Jets are getting someone who can still put up wide receiver 1 level production with enough targets, which you would have to think he's going to get now paired up with his old BFF Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah. So looking at this, we'll start here with the receivers. So I think there's a lot of positives here. Number one, the Jets like to run a lot of heavy personnel. So I think we're going to mostly see 2 tight ends. We're going to see a fullback. We're going to see a lot of those sets. And then the 2 wide receivers. So what does that mean? It means a very consolidated offense around Davante Adams as well as Garrett Wilson. Guys, Garrett Wilson sitting at a 31% target share for the season. I know he hasn't looked exactly on the same page all the time with Aaron Rodgers, but I don't think his target share is going to completely just evaporate to dust. I think they're going to be dead even. I'm projecting this as 24-25% target share to each player the rest of the way. The guys that really get cut out of the picture here are Adam Lazard, Mike Williams. We'll see. Maybe one of those guys ends up, once this is all finalized, and one of them end up going back to the Raiders. We'll see what happens with that. Mike Williams might make some sense, for the Raiders. I don't know if they would want his contract, but looking at these 2 wide receivers, I think they're still going to be in play, Ian. I've got them graded as mid-range wide receiver 2s the rest of the way. I actually went back and plugged them into my rest of season projections this morning. And with the numbers that I just gave you, that comes in right now for the Jets. That puts Garrett Wilson at wide receiver 19 the rest of the way, and Davante Adams at wide receiver 17. Got a slight edge there to Davante Adams because I do think, Ian, he probably ends up scoring maybe a touchdown, maybe 2 touchdowns extra over what we get from Garrett Wilson. The big reason why is I know that Adams is going to be trusted down inside the red zone. I know he's going to be a guy he's going to look for in the end zone. We even saw last night, Garrett Wilson, it was a tough catch, man. He came up with the catch. He got nailed between 2 guys, but he's not very big. He had 3 targets last night in the end zone. And so I think that Davante Adams gives you a bigger weapon that can be more physical at the point of attack. So I'd give a very, very slight nod to Davante in the ranks the rest of the way. But Garrett Wilson's the younger player, Ian. It's really a coin flip between the 2, both mid-range wide receiver 2s the rest of the way. What are your thoughts?
I'm with you where I would project a pretty even target share, but we should probably give Adams the edge, Dwayne. Garrett dominating, I get it, but just against Lazard and Mike Williams, I do think that if we had to go ahead and pick Adams or Garrett Wilson, we would lean towards Adams getting more targets.
Well, I think it's tricky just because Adams is also the older player, so we don't know, is he regressing or not? Garrett Wilson is still really in his prime. So I'm with you. I think you could argue it either way. I've got a very slight lean to Davante Adams, in the ranks for some of the reasons you just mentioned. But again, I really do look at this as more of a coin flip, and I don't have a strong enough stance either way to say, no, it's going to be this guy or it's going to be this guy. I agree with you. We could talk pros and cons for a pretty long time on both sides of it. Yeah. But in the end, they probably pretty much balance out. Very slight lean to Davante Adams, but I could easily see it still being the Garrett Wilson show.
Where was Garrett before in the rest of season rankings? Because as much as I'm with you, I don't think he's going to disappear from this offense. Still a very talented player. I'm also not going to sit here and cope and say, no, this is actually great news for Garrett Wilson, because we do now have more target competition than ever.
Yeah, more target competition is going to offset the fact that he is going to get better looks in coverage, right? So there's going to be a little bit more of an opportunity for some big plays, and we know that Garrett Wilson has that in his bag. He's not going to get as much coverage rolled his way. So those things are going to help. But to your point, overall, he's going to lose some targets here. He was already sitting right now as a borderline mid-range wide receiver one after his last two performances. I'm a major Garrett Wilson believer. I mean, I just look at what he's done over the first few years and think mostly it's been circumstantial as to why he hadn't scored the fantasy points, and it tied mostly to the terrible quarterback play. I know it was rough to start the season, but really catching his groove these last two games, I would say, like, is it in the range of outcomes that Garrett Wilson suddenly turns into a low-end wide receiver too? Yeah. But that could also be Davante Adams. And so it could be a situation where one's a high-end wide receiver two, the other's a low. We just saw that same exact scenario this last weekend with Stephon Diggs, right? And, Tank Dell. And a consolidated offense likes to run, heavy personnel packages. You only really got two guys out there that are battling for targets with a good quarterback. Now, CJ Stroud's obviously better than Aaron Rodgers at this point in his career, but I think it's a pretty similar situation. We've also seen that same scenario play out in Miami. Tua playing in those same types of formations where both those guys are getting the targets. Now, obviously, Tyreek has led the way there. So here's the good news, guys. They're both going to get plenty of targets. It could go either way as to which one ends up. One of them could dominate and be at like a 30% target share, but I think it's really hard to sit here and say today that we would for sure know which one gets that nod.
Would be very surprised if either Allen Lazard or especially Mike Williams, especially given the post-game comments, if you will, post-game throwing him under the bus sort of situation from Aaron Rodgers, would indicate there. Slight downgrade, as you kind of mentioned at the top of the show, Dwain, for Breeland Hall. Not that he's actually toppling out of our top 10 or even top 5 running backs, but just again that overall target ceiling does take a bit of a hit here.
Yeah, and it's tricky with Brees because we also got really positive news yesterday in our first game with Todd Downing calling plays, where he really had the best utilization that we have seen since week 1 of this year. He had a 9.7 utilization score yesterday, scored 21 fantasy points, dominated all the snaps, dominated all the rushing attempts, dominated all the route participation. So if they stick with that, it's still going to be enough to be okay. But to your point, when you've got these two type of target earners, you have really no shot at like a 20% target share for Breeland Hall. That was on the table every week right now with just Garrett Wilson being the primary weapon. Now you got Davante Adams. It's going to be a real struggle, but he could still be, in that 14, 15% range, which is still better than most running backs in the league. He's just not going to carry that Kamara CMC type level ceiling that we saw in the previous week. So when I look at Breeland Hall, I think at a bottom line, Ian, like still mid-range running back one. But if he gets the same utilization next week, obviously the targets are going to come down. But if he gets that many of the snaps and that many of the rushing attempts again next week, and an offense that's actually better now, he does pick up some touchdown upside. So I would say that's it kind of offsets a little bit of our worry about the targets that would be coming his way, is if this actually does translate into a better offense for the Jets, which really leads us to, what do you think about Aaron Rodgers the rest of the way, man?
It's about to say, man, that really is the major winner here. And the one thing we can all agree on, hasn't exactly been the cleanest 6 weeks. We've seen some highs, the Patriots game, and even last night, man. I mean, my God, that throw to Lazard, I think it was, where the linebacker had his back turned to him. Like, you still see the
Lazard right in the balls.
Yeah. You still see the vintage flashes from Rodgers. His arm strength looks fine. Even his mobility, man, for a guy his age coming off the Achilles, I don't think has been this massive culprit, or thorn in his side or anything like that. So with Rodgers, doesn't have a top 10 finish yet this season. He's actually ripped off, QB 27, 13, 11, 20, 18, and most recently 15 finishes. So I'm not expecting him to all of a sudden crack the position's top 5, but all of a sudden, Dwain, when it's Aaron Rodgers versus guys like Goff versus Kirk Cousins, those passers that we had in a similar tier in the preseason and who we've seen admittedly kind of outperform Rodgers, at least in fantasy land so far this year, certainly think he can close that gap. If not, leap him,
That's the tier. You just mentioned it. Like, these guys really don't run at all. Yes, Rodgers has looked more mobile than maybe we would expect at his age, but not running a lot, mostly dependent, on his ability to drop back as a pocket passer. And so that comes down to, okay, we got to look at the weapons. Well, up till now, like, Jared Goff's had a very clear advantage, probably still has the advantage with, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams plus Sam Laporta, but still it's a lot closer now that you add Davante Adams to Garrett Wilson. So yeah, I think he's exactly in that range you talked about, which most of the time it comes down to matchup. It's a borderline QB1. And in the matchups that we like, where we think there could be a shootout or you get a soft secondary on the other side, they're moving into our top 12 for the week. You get into a matchup where we think, oh my God, like this is really going to be tough from a coverage standpoint, they fall to QB 15, 16. So I think that's going to be the weekly story with Aaron Rodgers. But I do think he has a chance to kind of rewrite it. If he comes out super hot, like over the next 2 games and plays well, we could be moving him into the top 12 QBs the rest of the way.
Looking at the QB rankings or just overall finishes so far this year, Dwain, guys like Geno Smith, Brock Purdy, CJ Stroud, I think we're obviously taking them ahead of Rodgers. And then we have the more dual threat sort of players, Jalen Hurts, Caleb Williams rising, and then some of the guys, in the top 5. But once we get to Rodgers versus Dak Prescott, how are we feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting into that same range. I'm still trusting Dak just because, man, we've seen it for so many years. I know he had the dud this last weekend, but Dak has just every year been a top 10 QB. So it would take a little bit for Rodgers to pass him, but Rodgers could get into that conversation with Davante Adams on the team. I think the other thing that will be really interesting, Ian, is to see how does this offense morph from a standpoint of how they want to balance things out? Because they've been more of a balanced offense to this point. That's really going to be the history of the play callers as well here. They've been more to that balance. So I think you're going to have to win with some efficiency from Rodgers, which it's not necessarily a bad thing. I just still don't think this offense turns into that kind of team that wants to drop back and throw the ball all the times. Obviously, like Seattle's an extreme example of what we're getting with Geno Smith, but we might get a little bit more passing. So I think that's the other part that we've got to watch here over the next couple of games. Do they actually morph into a little bit more of a pass-heavy team? And if that happens, plus the 2 weapons, then yeah, there are roads to where we could have Aaron Rodgers in the top 10 within the next 2 to 3 weeks.
Now, Dwain did say 2 to 3 weeks. So I don't think it's going to be this week on a road trip to Pittsburgh against TJ Watt and company. But after that, Dwain, I mean, we were talking about it on the show earlier today, guys like Sam Darnold and I forget the other quarterback that has a really good stretch here coming up. But man, once we get to week 8 and beyond, the Patriots, Stroud, that's it. Yeah. We get the Patriots in week 8, already saw what Rodgers and the Adams-less Jets did against them in the first matchup. Then the Texans, a secondary that really hasn't looked great in some of their bigger matchups this year. The Cardinals, then the Colts before that week 12 bye. Again, great day to be an Aaron Rodgers, Davante Adams, and yes, maybe even Garrett Wilson fantasy manager. Now, just quickly on the other side of the coin, Dwain, not like we need to overly project what this Raiders offense is going to look like because we already have a 2-game stretch of them without Davante Adams. But mainly, I would just think Brock Bowers to the moon if he's not already there. And then Jacoby Myers, someone who we can confidently rely on as a wide receiver 3 sort of option, at least once he himself is healthy.
Some would say there were already pics of Brock Bowers, like whenever with Neil Armstrong and the rest of, the Apollo crew. So he's obviously already staked his claim to your point, but it's still good news for him. I mean, Davante Adams not being in there, man, when we look at it just over these last couple of games for Brock Bowers, it's absolutely freaking insane, man. The guy's got 34% and 31% target shares. It's tough. I can't put him over Kelsey because Kelsey has Mahomes. But right there, I do think I could make him 2. And it's him and Trey McBride, man. Yeah. They're battling it out. Him and Trey McBride are both they're both earning their targets. And you could argue that really man, come on, Kyler, what the hell are you doing, bro? This is not really that good. You're not playing well at all. So I mean, if Kyler's going to be throwing for 200, 225 yards per game, really what's the difference between him and either Aiden O'Connell or Gardner Minshew? Because that's what they've been doing, throwing for 200, 225 yards per game. So I think that you have a tie. Look at me. I'm such a coward. A tie for tight end 2 the rest of the way with Brock Bowers and Trey McBride. I can see that battle going either way, Ian. But the bottom line is, man, you're absolutely loving having either one of those guys on your team. And Brock Bowers, man, utilization scores of 9.5 and 9.0 over the last 2 games. He's just going to kill it, man. I think the big question is these other couple of guys. And I really think by what we've seen over the last couple of games, Trey Tucker, he had that little brief moment where he shined. Yeah. And we were like, okay, did we miss something on this prospect? Because he wasn't a great prospect coming out as far as the things we look at, and we can be wrong about those things, folks. So we always give guys a chance. But then last year as a rookie, kind of low-end target earner, gave you some big plays, was a deep A-dot kind of guy. But he had that 23 and 25% target share in week 3 and 4 and got us a little bit excited. He just fell completely off the earth, 11% and 3% over the last 2 games. So I think that points to big things for Jacoby Myers. I think Jacoby Myers is now a borderline wide receiver 2 the rest of the way. This dude has had target shares of 26%, 42%, and 26% did not play last weekend, was a late week downgrade to doubtful and ended up not playing. But man, that's really strong stuff. So even in an offense that's throwing for 200, 225 yards per game, I think Bowers and Myers, like that's it. It's going to be tough to support anything more than that, but that's obviously where we would put our chips, Hartitz.
Dealing with that ankle injury, hardly ideal for, Jacoby Myers, but if he can get right, Dwain,
got to get healthy. Yep.
Week 7 against the Rams, certainly a matchup that we will be
Ooh,
trying
yeah.
to eat into that one. Final point, I just want to say, you're not wrong. I think you're right, but it was really depressing to hear you say what's the difference between Kyler Murray and Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell. Come on, man.
I hate it, man. I know. I'm just saying, as you know, look, we obviously know the ceiling is still bigger for Kyler, but Kyler's got to do his thing, man. So I don't know.
And just from passing production, we all know
Yes.
Kyler's better
Yeah.
and has the rushing and stuff, but what a time to be alive. So, guys, that's going to, again, be our just wrap up, our quick breakdown here of the situation. But wow.
Quick recap, Ian. Rodgers, borderline QB1. Davante Adams, mid-range wide receiver 2. Garrett Wilson, mid-range wide receiver 2. Breeland Hall's a mid-range running back 1. But if we get another week like last week where he's the clear leader, he will be back into the top 3 running back conversation the rest of the way.
You guys heard it from Mr. McFarland himself. So make sure you guys check out fantasylife.com. We'll have plenty of updated information and takes on the situation as the day unfolds. And I'm sure we'll be talking a little bit more about it tomorrow on the Fantasy Life Show, which we also invite you to check out. 9 a.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday. Always a great day to be great there. So for Dwain, I'm Ian. Thanks again for tuning into this Breaking News Fantasy Life segment. And until next time, take care, everybody.